Welcome. Thank you for joining us for First Person Conversations with Holocaust Survivors. I'm Bill Benson, and I have hosted First Person since it began at the museum in 2000. We are in our 25th year. Each month, we share firsthand accounts of survival during the Holocaust. Each of our First Person guests serves as a volunteer at the museum. Holocaust survivors are Jews who experienced the persecution and survived the mass murder that was carried out by the Nazis and their collaborators. This included those who were in concentration camps, killing centers, ghettos, and prisons, as well as refugees or those in hiding. Holocaust survivors also include people who did not self-identify as Jewish, but were categorized as such by the perpetrators. During our program, please send us your questions and let us know where you are watching from in the live chat. We are honored to have Holocaust survivor Rose-Helene Spreiregen share her firsthand account of survival with us. Rose-Helene, thank you for joining us and for agreeing to be our first person.
Hello, everyone. I am sorry I'm a little hoarse today. I hope you can hear me.
We will be able to hear you just fine, Rose-Helene. I'm so glad that you're doing this with us today. And we'll get started because you have so much to share in our short hour together today. Rose-Helene, you were born on March 6, 1931 in Paris, France. Before you share what happened to you and your family during World War II and the Holocaust, please tell us a little about your family's life before the war.
My family decided to leave Poland and to come to Paris. They tried to leave because of the pogroms and anti-Semitism. They came to Paris because my grandmother had a sister's family, two sisters, her husbands, and the children had already immigrated to Paris.
Rose-Helene, did you have other family members that were in Paris besides the ones you've mentioned or elsewhere living in France at that time?
I do not believe so. I really don't know. All I know is the people who were in France. I have no idea who was left in Poland.
Your mother became a single mother caring for you. How did she support herself and you?
These were very difficult times. And she was a dressmaker and tried to do the best she could to survive and help me. This is me with my mother when I was about 3 years old.
And Rose-Helene, as you said, times were difficult. They were tough for your mother. And during that time, you would often go back and forth between your grandmother and your mother. And you also spent some time in a foster home. What was that like for you as best you recall?
I remember actually very little about the foster homes when I was very little. I just remember one family where I was, and these people would get a horse and a wagon ready every Sunday, and everyone would go to church. That's about all I can remember.
Mm-hmm. At the age of 5, you were sent to live at a boarding house for Jewish children, and you attended a public school that was nearby. What do you remember of your experience at the boarding house?
The boarding house was a very nice place, except I was one of the youngest, and that was difficult because I didn't have any siblings like most of the other people. The reason actually I went there is my mother had friends whose 4 girls were at this boarding house. And we were going to school outside. All I can remember is being very lonesome, very sad. And all I can remember is working very hard in school. This was, I guess, compensation.
Yeah, in fact, one of the things that you shared with me is that sense of being alone, even not feeling wanted in some ways that you shared with me, that made you a terrific student. You worked very hard. Tell us about what it meant to be a terrific student.
It meant to work very hard. And actually, I didn't realize how good a student I was. But at the end of my stay there in 1939, the last year I was in school, I got at the graduation 3 first prizes of different things, like I can't remember what. Plus, I got the prize, which was a big book, gilded. It was just beautiful. That was very, very special.
And Rose-Helen, in addition to achieving so much in school, you also worked in the kitchen, yet you had to be 6 years old to work in the kitchen in the boarding house. And in order to do that, you had to get your mother's help and essentially get her to lie about your age. Will you tell us more about that?
We could work in the kitchen on Sunday only. The reason I wanted to help in the kitchen to do dishes is because Sunday was the day where parents would come to visit their children. My mother couldn't come very often, so I was by myself walking around at this big park, and it was very, very sad. So I decided to go help in the kitchen. The problem was I wasn't 6, I was 5.5, but I had to lie because I just didn't want to be in this park seeing all the parents visit their children, and I was by myself. And one day, my mother came to visit me on a Sunday. And the first thing I did, I was, of course, so happy to see her. But the first thing I said to my mother, how old am I exactly? And she said 5.5. And I said, if anyone asks you, tell them I am 6. I can't remember if she asked me why, but I needed her to confirm that I was 6 so I could continue working on Sundays in the kitchen.
Mhm. And as you said, the motivation for you, of course, was that so often that it was your mother and grandmother couldn't come, and so that way you could be in the kitchen away from all the others. Rose-Helen, we have a photograph here of you at that time. Tell us about this.
I was probably about 5.5 at that time, about the age I was in this boarding place.
It's a beautiful photo. Rose-Helen, World War II began on September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. Fearing German attacks, you, your grandmother, and your cousin Bernard relocated to the French countryside while your mother remained in Paris. Where did the 3 of you go?
The 3 of us were sent to Savigny-sur-Bray, and it was a place in the country where they thought children and elder people would be safe because they were afraid if they stayed in Paris, there would be bombing and it would not be safe for the children and elderly. And my mother stayed because she was young and she was in her 20s and she had to work.
Mhm.
So she was not evacuated.
Tell us about this photograph.
This photograph is my grandmother, my little cousin Bernard, and me. And I was about 8.5 or 9 years old.
Mhm. While you were in Savigny-sur-Bray, you and Bernard attended school. What do you recall about that time and your relationship with Bernard?
I was always very close to my cousin Bernard because he was an only child, and so was I. We went to school, and that was my apron uniform. And for several months, things seemed totally normal, not like being during the war. And that was just wonderful for a few months.
Mhm. And this photograph is taken from around that time, I believe.
It was taken from the school, I
Yeah.
guess.
Rose-Helen, before we go on, I'd like you to know that we have people that are watching and listening to you from all over the country and other places in the world. We have viewers who are watching today from Massachusetts, Oklahoma, Montana, Pennsylvania, and New Mexico, to name a few. And I'd like to welcome those viewers who are watching today from Denmark, France, Canada, and South Africa. I'd also like to share a comment just sent in by Julianne, who's watching. Julianne writes, Rose-Helen, such a lovely name for a beautiful, brave soul. So glad to hear your story. Bless you. Rose-Helen, the war came to you in May 1940 when Germany invaded France and other nearby countries. As a result of that, there was a mass exodus of people, including your mother, who, as you said, had stayed behind in Paris to work. So this mass exodus fled Paris for other parts of France. What do you recall of the refugees who were fleeing and passing through Savigny-sur-Bray?
Yes, I can recall, I can remember vividly. And this is the scenes that we would see going through. They were on the little roads and going through Savigny-sur-Bray. These people put everything they had on their carts, their cars, and they were fleeing. They started off with Belgium, Netherlands, which was invaded before Paris. They were just aimlessly going on the roads, leaving, walking, going south. And I remember when they went through Savigny-sur-Bray, my grandmother would give them a little bread, a little water. They had absolutely nothing. And the exodus was most chaotic time I can remember.
It was literally hundreds of thousands of Parisians fleeing, and what a remarkable photograph this is. Your mother, who had been in Paris then, of course, she fled in the Exodus and she joined you in Savigny-sur-Bray, but she had been wounded. Can you tell us what happened to her?
Well, she came to visit us in Savigny-sur-Bray. There was some bombing and she was injured. She got a shrapnel in her foot. Unfortunately, all the doctors were already gone. Everyone had fled. So we had to get back to Paris as soon as we could, so she could be able to take care of her foot. And we joined this exodus, except we were going north and they were going south. This was so incredibly chaotic and scary. Plus, there were also bombings while we were on the road. And we had to flee and hide in the ditches until it was over, and then get back on the road and trying to reach Paris, which we did eventually.
I'm trying to just picture, as I imagine our audience is, the streams of refugees, tens and hundreds of thousands, and you and your mom are trying to make your way against the tide, literally, while under attack from German planes and others. So the image of that is extraordinary. But as you said, you did make it. You and your mother made it back to Paris. What about your grandmother and your cousin Bernard? When did they get back to Paris?
They came back to Paris after us. I am not sure how much later, but probably a couple of weeks later, when the trains were available.
Mhm. Pretty much after everybody else had left Paris at that point. Yeah. Um, Before we go on, Rose-Helen, I'd like to remind our audience to please share the questions that you have for Rose-Helen. Please share them via our chat feature. Thank you. France was then divided into two main zones. Germany occupied the north and the Atlantic coastline, while the south of France remained unoccupied. Nazi Germany, however, installed a collaborationist government known as Vichy France. Anti-Jewish laws and severe restrictions were implemented throughout Nazi-controlled France. How did life change with those restrictions and changes? How did life change for you and your family?
It really changed a lot, because the first thing that we had to do, the Jews had to go register with the French police, which we did. And from then on, we had to start dealing with the incredibly difficult laws against Jews. Like, there was a curfew at 6. Like, you could not go shopping during the day. It was on, you were allowed only 1 hour from 3 to 4. You could not on a radio. You could not have a telephone. You could not go to a movie theater. You could not go to a restaurant. There was so little that we were permitted to do. You couldn't travel further than 25 kilometers from Paris, which is about 17 miles, like the suburbs. If there was an air raid, you couldn't go to the shelter. It was because it was after the curfew usually. There were so many restrictions. It became really frightening. And also, you couldn't even go to a little park in the middle of summer. It says here you see a park which is reserved for children, but it was forbidden to Jews.
Let's linger on this picture for just a moment, Rose-Helen, if you don't mind, and with the
Yes.
caption. This is a playground reserved for children. Jews are forbidden. So in every way, these restrictions were restricting your life in every way, and particularly your ability to communicate. As you said, no phones, in every way, and the curfew of 6 p.m. And I want to make sure we all heard you say that you were permitted to shop for 1 hour a day.
1 hour a day, exactly.
Yeah.
And the lines were very, very big. So sometimes after standing for an hour in a line, you would get to the store and the item you needed was gone because there were so few. There was so little to buy with Russian cards.
We have another terrible photograph to share. Tell us about this, Rose-Helen.
This was a very, very popular exhibit in Paris in 1941. It was incredibly popular, and it showed posters of Jews which were just so frightening. Jews being the devil, Jews being absolutely the worst. And people were standing in line to get to this exhibit. I remember it was so scary to see it.
Mhm. All these anti-Jewish laws, among them, of course, was the requirement that you had to wear the yellow Star of David badge. Will you tell us about that?
Yes, and actually, in 1941, they started to round up foreign Jews, foreign men, and my uncles and cousins were rounded up and went to 3 different camps. They were holding camps, which was Compiègne, Baudelaire-Hollande, and Pithiviers. And they were held there from May 1941 to June 1942. In June of 19, and at that point, everyone was deported. We didn't know that it was Auschwitz, but that's where they were deported to. And my uncles and cousins never came back. In June of 1942, we were issued, every person over the age of 6 was issued 3 stars of David, and they were supposed to be sewn on their outer garment. They couldn't be pinned. This is I have actually one here, and you had to put it on. It had to be worn at all times on your outer garment. And starting from then on, it became even more difficult. I couldn't go to school anymore because they were taking out children from school and they were deporting them. Again, we didn't know they were deporting them to Auschwitz. And my little schoolmate, who were arrested in school, never came back.
Rose-Helen, as you've started to describe for us, the mass deportations really began on a large-scale, systematic basis of Jews in the summer of 1942 in Paris. Your mother got a warning that a major roundup was going to happen, and she quickly made arrangements for you to flee south to the unoccupied part of France, with the idea that your grandmother and you would follow. So tell us about this warning to the extent that you can, about the warning that your mother got and about her plans to leave and then have you and your grandmother follow her.
My mother apparently knew a policeman, friendly policeman, who came to warn her that there was going to be a massive roundup. And indeed it was. On July 16 and July 17, 1942, there was a massive roundup. They were all Jewish people, elderly people, children, adults, everyone. And this policeman warned her about it. So immediately she went into hiding and she tried to find someone who would make false papers, which apparently she did, and find also she had a couple of friends, a few friends who had the same predicament. They found a smuggler who would take them over to the free zone. They left within a few days to get to the free zone, not knowing where they were going. And my mother took all the money she had with her. And she said, of course, to my grandmother and me that we would join as soon as she found the place to stay. Unfortunately, the smuggler betrayed that little group. Everyone was arrested and sent to Drosy, which was the holding camp before they were deported to Auschwitz. And
This
actually, the reason we learned about her arrest is she managed to get a postcard that she threw out the window of the train. And someone picked it up and mailed it. So we heard that she had been arrested.
the remarkable nature of what you just described, that she tossed it out the window and somebody did mail it to you, and that's how you found out that she had been deported. Tell this photograph, Rose-Helen, is especially significant. Will you tell us about it?
It is. This is the last picture of my mother that she had made to put on the false papers. And that's the last picture of her that I have. And she was 31.
And as you described, the place that she was sent to, Drancy, which was a holding camp or a transit camp before deportation. Say a little bit about this photograph.
This photograph shows women and children being held in Drancy, and apparently they seem to be doing some kind of washing their laundry.
It's particularly poignant just seeing that there are so many children in that particular scene, Rose-Helen. You, as you described, you were able to find out, because of the postcard, to find out that your mother had left Drancy. Tell us what you have learned about how she ended up leaving Drancy, escorting children. Will you tell us about that?
Yes. We learned from a neighbor and a friend who was a very close friend and very, very sick. And she was sent back to her home. And in fact, she died 2 months later in Paris. But she saw my mother, and my mother told her that they were making convoys, of course, of adults, men and women, but children were left behind. And when they had enough children, they would make a convoy of children. And they asked to have 2 volunteers per wagon. And these cattle cars were packed with children. My mother volunteered to be one of the volunteers in one of these children's convoy. And it was apparently horrible because they had no way to sit down, no sanitation, no food, nothing to drink. This was in August. It was very hot. And train, this cattle car, took probably about 4 days to reach Auschwitz. And we learned after the war that, of course, many people died before they reached Auschwitz. But the ones who were still alive were murdered on arrival. And this is probably what happened to my mother. Either she died before she got to Auschwitz, or she was murdered once she got there.
And Rose-Helen, of course, the plan had been for you and your grandmother to join your mother, and that didn't happen. So as a result, you and your grandmother would spend the next year in your mother's apartment in Paris. Tell us what the conditions were like for you and your grandmother during that year.
The conditions were very, very difficult. My grandmother never, ever left the apartment for 13 months. So it meant that I was in charge of doing whatever needed to be done outside. And I had to be very careful not to do anything to be arrested because my grandmother would never know what happened and she would be left alone in the apartment. It was, I think, such a difficult time. If we wanted to find out how anyone was doing, if anyone was still there or not arrested, I had to walk there. I could take the subway, but we were permitted only the last wagon. And sometimes when we left this wagon, this last, I could see that at the end, at the exit, there was a roundup. So I would get right back into the train and get off at the next station, hoping that the next station, the exit would be free. But most of the time, I would walk to places because it was a little safer to do that. But it was a very hard time because I had to stand in line. I would stand for an hour, sometimes to get to whatever I needed, not to be able to get it because it was sold out. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, there was not much left. And when I was standing in line with all these women, they were cursing me, calling me names, calling me dirty Jew, sometimes kike. And all I wanted to do is just run away. It was so scary and demeaning to be called names. And I couldn't leave. I had to stand there and take the abuse because there was no one else who could bring in the food or take care of what needed to be done. That was very, very hard.
And just to add to that, of course, you're still very much a little girl, and you're out there trying to get the food and the other necessities of life because your grandmother could not leave the apartment. If I remember correctly, your grandmother somehow was able to bribe the doorman, I believe, at the apartment, so that if anybody asked, he would say that the apartment was empty, right?
Yes, we had to bribe the concierge so if anyone came to say that the apartment was empty, since the person who lived there had been deported. And sometimes we had to spend a night in the attic because we heard rumors which were frightening. We also had a terrific neighbor who had a laundromat downstairs. And a couple of times they let us stay there and overnight because this is where usually the roundups took place. And I remember sleeping on the big, huge ironing table.
Mhm. Your apartment was located on a street corner, and so you could look out. And what did you see and hear from your window?
What we saw is what was happening. And if you saw a truck, especially at night, you knew that they were coming to arrest people. And we had some friends who were hiding in the different streets near the apartment. And once in a while would see a family being arrested, said, "Oh, here are the Goldbergs being arrested." And it was so scary because you didn't know if anyone was going to come for you, if anyone was going to denounce you. You always lived with fear, not knowing who was going to be next.
I want to share a question that's just come in from JP, person named JP. JP asks, do you recall understanding much of what was happening in the world at that time, or were you too young at the time, or just simply bewildered, or to add to that, I'd say, or just too terrified with what you've just described?
I remember everything perfectly well. I was 11 years old, but I had to grow up very, very fast. So whatever I saw, it was terrifying, but I felt that whatever I was doing, I had to do it. No one else could do it.
Given that, Rose-Helen, knowing that you had to do what you had to do, but yet everything was so scary, how do you think you managed under those circumstances to be able to grow up so fast, other than you just had to do it?
I had to grow up very fast because I had to help my grandmother, who was elderly. She was a refugee. The French was pretty poor, and I was outside the eyes and the ear for her. So instead of having an adult taking care of me, I became the adult in charge.
Mm. Your cousin Bernard and his mother managed to make it out of Paris, and in August 1943, the following year, after the year you've described, your grandmother decided it would be best for the two of you to also leave Paris. How did the two of you escape Paris, and where did you go?
Well, there was no other place to go but to join my aunt and my cousin. And by August 1943, the roundups became even closer. And my grandmother decided it was time to leave. We couldn't stay in Paris anymore. So we managed to get someone to make us false papers, someone who was in the underground. Everyone had a specialty in the underground. You made false papers, so you blew up railroad tires. Anyway, I have no idea how we found this person who made us false papers, and we were ready to leave. We had to tell my aunt that we were coming, and since it was everything was how should I say, everything was red, so we had to send a postcard saying that we're coming on vacation, and she understood what it was. The problem was that it was an overnight train, and we were going to have two checkpoints. One was the German checkpoint and one was the French checkpoint. I knew that if my grandmother opened her mouth, we would be arrested. So in my 12-year-old wisdom, I told my grandmother, it will be best if I take care of the papers and you make believe that you're sleeping. And that's what we did. When we got the first checkpoint, the German police, they came and handed them the papers. They said, this is the papers. That's my grandmother. But I can't remember if I said, don't wake her up. And they looked at her, they looked at me, and they gave me back the papers. And what probably was just a couple of minutes, to me it seemed like an eternity. But then we had to get the second checkpoint, the French checkpoint, with the French police, and I had to do exactly the same thing. This was so scary because if they had tried to wake up my grandmother, we would have been arrested, of course. So we were lucky. They gave back the papers and they went on. But I was so scared. I don't believe I've ever been more frightened in my life. I was shaking for hours after that, but we managed to get through, and we got to Veron to
And
meet my
I want to ask
aunt.
you about that, if I could, Rose-Helen. So you and your grandmother got to Veron, as you were about to tell us. A viewer that's watching today named Madeline. Madeline's asking, what were living conditions like for you and your grandmother when you were in Veron?
First of all, we couldn't stay with my aunt because she had a very small place. And also, it would have been way too conspicuous to be together. So we had to find a place which was very, very difficult. And we found something like a warehouse where no one had lived in. It had been storage for furniture for about 10 years. And all we had was cold running water. And also what it had lots of mice. So we had to, it was empty. So we had to find also someone to lend us a mattress, some pots and pans, a stove, so we could cook and keep warm because it was in the mountains. It was cold. And my aunt had a neighbor who was wonderful. That's the neighbor, and that's me. And Veron, when I was 12, she very nicely lent us a mattress and some pots and pans and a stove. And this way we could cook and keep warm. But we had to go to the woods in order to get some dead branches and carry them back for 2 or 3 miles, cut them up by hand, and try to cook with that and keep warm. It was extremely, extremely hard to do all this, but we did. We had to do it.
In addition to going out those 2 or 3 miles to the woods to get branches, as you said, in order to cook and to heat the house, the little place you were in, you also were gathering chestnuts and walnuts from the woods as part of your food supply. Will you say a bit about that?
Yes, it was an area near Veron where they had chestnuts. We would go to the woods and gather chestnuts and cook them. And that was a little nourishment. As for the walnuts, they were not in the woods. They belonged to people and their garden. So, of course, we couldn't go inside their garden, but whatever fell on the road, we could pick up and take it. And this again, it was something we could eat. But there were also other things. My grandmother was very enterprising, and we had really not much food and not much money. And she would go to the different stores like the butcher, the bakery, and she asked if anyone had anything to be fixed. Everyone had things to be fixed. You couldn't buy sheets, you couldn't buy shirts, you couldn't buy anything. So my grandmother would take it home and she would fix everything by hand and bring it back. And then when I said, "How much do we owe you?" Oh, she said, "No, no, I don't want money. But if you have a little cheese or some eggs or a little meat." So this was a little supplement to our very meager rations.
And in order to really survive and eat, you also had to have ration cards in order to get what the little bit of food that was available. How did you manage to get a hold of ration cards?
Every month, we had to go to the town hall in order to get the ration cards. There were always very long lines because there were very few employees. And every month we had to do the same thing, to go to the town hall every ration card every month was a different color, had different things, so you couldn't cheat. But aside from that, we really didn't have much money. So I had to find some work to do to make a little money. So my aunt found a little grocery store where they needed someone to take care of it. The husband was a prisoner of war, and the wife was very sick with tuberculosis. So they needed someone to run the store and preferably not pay much. So, of course, when you have a 12-year-old, you don't pay very much. So I was hired to run this grocery store. And obviously, I didn't know how to do it, so I had to learn how to take care of it, how to take care of the ration cards, how to get the food back, the reassortment. And we lived about 3 miles from this little place. It was dark roads and they were very narrow. This lady very nicely offered to lend me her bicycle, which was extremely nice, except I didn't know how to ride a bicycle. I never had a bicycle, and I had to learn how to ride this bicycle without killing myself. But I was too embarrassed to say that I didn't know how to do it. So again, to learn how to ride a bike without killing myself, so I could also go back and forth and also get all the reassortment and all the boxes that we needed for this little grocery store.
I'm just going to let that sink in with our audience for a minute. 12 years old, and you are essentially running this little grocery store, meaning getting the supplies to sell there, to collect payments, and to get yourself to and from. Will you share with us, as part of the enterprising nature of your grandmother and of yourself, of course, you were able to take some of those rations that you decided that you wouldn't use for yourselves, and barter them for other needed supplies, other food.
Yes, we did. For example, being a child, I was permitted to have 1 bar of chocolate a month. This was a very precious commodity. But of course, I was not going to touch this. It was a good bartering kind of thing. So we would change it. We found a family which had lots of children, and they had milk. We did not. So they would get that. We also, my grandmother, being an adult, was permitted to have a bottle of wine, not one of those nice bottles of Chateau Lafite. It was from a keg. You'd bring your bottle and they would fill it up. And we found someone who was dying to have wine. And this person eventually not only gave us a little of the milk of all this big family, but he also came to put traps for the mice. And eventually he got 12 mice, which was incredible. Living with mice was really scary. Plus, they played havoc with lots of things. For example, we came each with a little suitcase. Again, we couldn't be conspicuous, and we didn't know if it was going to be 4 months or a year. So we just brought the minimum with us. We didn't have any place to hang anything. So we had to find some wooden boxes to fold our little belongings neatly in. One of my prized possessions was a woolen dress which had been made for me from a plaid blanket. So it was nicely folded, and that was my only very warm dress. And one day I took it out of the box, and the mice had decided to eat the whole front of it.
Mhm.
I couldn't wear it anymore. It was a real, very catastrophic thing for me.
Rose-Helen, you're in this little town and you're trying to be inconspicuous and try to survive. Did people in that town know that you were Jewish?
Oh, absolutely not.
No.
No one knew we were Jewish. And when people asked, how come you came from Paris to be in this little town? We'd say, oh, we had to leave because of the bombing. We couldn't stay in Paris anymore. In those days, obviously, you had no TV, you didn't have any of the things that you have now to tell exactly what it was. And I guess they believed it.
After the Allied invasion of France took place on D-Day, June 6, 1944, Veron was liberated a little bit later in August of 1944, meaning that you'd been there for a full year. Tell us what liberation was like for you.
It was like a ton of bricks that got off your shoulders. It was wonderful to feel that the war was finally ending. And as a child, I thought, well, everyone is going to come back from wherever they are. My mother will come back, my family will go back to Paris, everything will be normal again. And the American troops who liberated us in August of 1944 were very, very nice. They gave us crackers, which was wonderful. And I think some chocolate, I can't quite remember. But what I do remember is they gave us chewing gum. And I didn't know that this was to chew, not to eat. I never had heard of it. So I learned about chewing gum, and it was not an edible thing. It was to chew.
That was one of the things you learned from the American soldiers, right? Yeah. Rose-Helen, that was 1944 August, and of course the war ended in May of 1945 throughout Europe. And by 1947, you were living on your own, just age 16 by that time, in your mother's apartment in Paris. What was that like for you?
It was a very difficult time because by then I realized that there was no way that anyone was coming back. I didn't have any money. I couldn't continue school. When I came back within a few months from Veron, I managed to get a high school diploma, but I couldn't continue school. I had no money, despite the fact that I was a good student. It just didn't help. And education in France is free, but what is not free is food, pay the rent, and all of that. So I had to find a job. I found something. I found a job. I went to night school. I had to take care of the apartment. I had to try to do all the things that people do normally. And I was only 16. I had to learn as I was going. And it was very, very hard.
Mhm. Rose-Helen, I know our time is short and there's so much to share, but we do have a video question from a student, Emma, who is from Blacksburg, Virginia. Let's go ahead and hear from Emma. And when she asks her question, then I'll repeat it for you after she's finished.
Hi, My name is Emma. I am from Blacksburg, Virginia, and my question is, when you were waiting for your mother to return home, what was the grief process like when you realized she wasn't coming home?
Basically, what Emma's asking is, what was the grief process like for you when you realized that your mother wasn't coming home?
I think it's a difficult and painful question, actually, because there was no such thing as a grief process. There was never any time where I knew I could start grieving. There was never any time that it happened. My mother left one day in July of 1942, and she disappeared in thin air. I never knew when she died, how she died, how she died. I didn't know. And there was never any time at all that I could start grieving, feeling that this is the time to do it. I don't have a grave for her. It's like people who lose a loved one. They know when they can start grieving because it happened at a certain date. They have a grave that they can go to. But I have nothing. It never happened. It just vanished in thin air. So I never had a time when I could start saying, I can grieve now. It never happened.
I know that was a painful question, and thank you for an extraordinary answer to Emma. Rose-Helen, you and your grandmother survived together, of course. Did she remain in Paris?
Yes, she remained in Paris. She couldn't really leave because she was elderly, and where would she go?
And she remained in your life. In fact, we have a photograph that I want everybody to see. Tell us about this photograph.
This photograph actually is the day of my wedding, and it's the 22nd of October 1961. And as of yesterday, it was my 63rd anniversary. This is my grandmother and me.
Well, I know everybody watching joins me in wishing you a happy anniversary for yesterday.
Thank you.
Rose-Helen, I have just a final question for you today, and that is, as we face a dangerous surge in anti-Semitism, please tell us why you feel it is important to share your firsthand account of the Holocaust and what people can learn from it.
I am going to read you something small. Our strength as a nation lies largely in the diversity of its people, united in respect for each other. But some would divide us, trying to diminish our one group or another as unworthy or worse. The Jewish communities in our country are being attacked in this manner. The word for that is anti-Semitism, the oldest of all hatreds. In whatever country it has appeared in the past, it is a forerunner of self-destruction, which harms all. I know. I lived through it as a child in World War II in France. I've now lived in America for over 60 years and see the same thing emerging. That is why I speak up, appealing to the better nature of tolerance that gives America its strength. Tolerance not for some, but for all. Anti-Semitism has no place in America or elsewhere.
Rose-Helen, thank you so much for that. Before we close, I would like to share a comment that just came in from Douglas. And Douglas writes, Rose-Helen, Thank you so much for sharing memories of an unimaginable youth during the war and the Holocaust. You are clearly a determined and resilient soul, and thank you for inspiring us. Rose-Helen, I wish we'd had all afternoon, but thank you for sharing what you've shared, for the reasons you've shared. You referred to your grandmother as enterprising. There's no question that she was, but then you were extraordinarily enterprising, resilient, strong, and through all those scary moments, incredibly brave. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
I'd like to take a moment to thank our donor. First Person is made possible through the generous support from the Lewis Franklin Smith Foundation. And I'd also like to invite you to join us next month for another First Person program. Thank you for being with us today.